Hello, welcome to this instalment of the Weekly Squeak. Now, I've been doing this on and off, weekly, very tenuous weekly, for a few weeks, read 6 months. I had one episode with a couple of guests who weren't actually there with me, of course. They were in, where were they? They were in Zagreb and they were in Barcelona, I think. But that worked quite well. And I think some of the best podcasts that I like and I enjoy are ones where you have a couple of hosts. You get some different opinions, you get a bit of conversation, you get a bit of discussion. As much as I like just talking myself, I don't know. It was a bit. It was hard to fill the void sometimes. So I thought it was about time we tried the podcast with a co-host, and I actually had a very suitable co-host who. Well, I'll let them introduce themselves first, and then we'll explain how we know each other and what we do with each other. But so, firstly, my co-host to my left, actually, literally to my left, I can poke them.
Please don't.
So you've already heard her dulcet tones before she's had a chance to introduce herself. So who are you? Who the hell are you?
Hi, Chris. Hi, everyone that's listening. My name's Cate, and I am a fellow Berlin resident. As you can probably guess by my accent, I'm Australian. And I'm, as far as jobs go, and as far as careers at the moment, I work as a freelance tech journalist, which means I spend a lot of time interviewing people in the sector, particularly CEOs and CTOs and people doing all kinds of interesting things, whether they're startups or they're working in academia or they're working in out in the field in different capacities.
So how do we know each other?
Wow, it's a funny story, that. I mean...
Not really, but...
Chris and I have been married for 8 or 9 years, I believe.
So yeah, I got my wife on the show.
Yes, and so I think we've known each other maybe 11 years or something like that.
But I think we were actually, and this is going to be a bit of an experiment, we haven't really tried this before, we also still only have one microphone.
We do.
And I'm already looking at the levels, and I can see that I'm extremely loud, and Kate, you're extremely quiet. So either project, darling, or come a bit closer, or I'll just try to talk quieter, maybe. Or somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm always reluctant to start talking loudly because then you get those kind of drama school tones that sound, I don't know, very artificial. So I'll probably keep it...
I don't know what you mean.
I'll probably keep it at this volume and feel free to adjust.
But just talk to the microphone.
I am.
There it is. Okay. So we got inspired to maybe try this. We were in Warsaw in Poland last week, and we'll come to that in a minute. But as part of that, some of the guests were a professional podcasting couple called the Gilmore Gang, Steve and Tina Gilmore. And they were a very interesting couple. They're a very nice couple, being around the tech scene for quite a while. And they've also been doing this podcast together.
That's right.
And we kind of thought, and it's not actually, I mean, it's not the only podcast, not even the only tech podcast I've heard with couples. So, and seeing as I had a ready-made co-host in the same 75 square meters as me, I thought, why not try? So we thought we'll give this a go, see what happens. So basically, much like the accompanying blog, I may have a particular topic I'd like to discuss. But also we'll talk about some of the things we've been writing about, some of the people we've been speaking to, where we've been the past week. So, where have we been in the past week, Kate?
We've actually spent some time in Warsaw, in Poland. We travelled there by train, which is about, 5-6 hours from Berlin?
Yeah.
Which is not too bad, really. For an Australian, it's not far at all for us. It's quite nice. Quite a nice journey. And we went to Warsaw for Bitspiration, which is a startup conference in Warsaw. Interestingly, I think most of the people involved were actually from another part of Poland. They were from...
Krakow.
Yeah.
There was a lot of rivalry. I actually found out... Sorry, I'm eating raspberries. I do apologise. I actually found out doing a walking tour after Kate had left that one of the main reasons between the rivalry, aside from the fact that big cities in countries always like to rival each other,
True.
is that at some point in the past, the king of the time moved the capital from Krakow to Warsaw, and they still haven't got over it. And the main reason was, there were two reasons given. He was an alchemist, and he was trying to invent some kind of explosive material, and he blew up half of his castle.
Oh dear.
And couldn't be bothered rebuilding it, so decided just to start a new one in Warsaw. But also the other reason was he was also hoping to be, I can't remember if he was or was trying to be, the King of Sweden at the same time. And Warsaw was slightly closer to Sweden.
What, King of Sweden by marriage or by...
No, by conquering, I think.
Oh, okay.
And it was King Sebastian? Something like that. I don't know.
No
Anyway, that comes later. Let's get back to the Bitspiration.
Okay.
So, this was your first exploration of kind of Eastern-ish European tech scene, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. It was.
And it was an interesting event. It was in, not really an old, but it was still partially used, but the old bit of a bus garage, which meant that the registration desk was in a bus, and all the buses looked like they were hand-me-downs from Berlin.
They did.
Strangely. And they had, the back of a bus was a DJ booth. It felt a bit like a prison at times.
Yeah, it had a funny layout. It sort of had like a very large open plan space on the ground, which obviously was presumably to drive the buses into. Then you had on the first floor, if you like, a kind of suite of offices around the perimeter of the square.
I think using the word suite very liberally.
Yes, very liberally. So it had. I don't know if you've seen prison shows where they have sort of a large central area, then up a flight of stairs there's like a balcony, perhaps is the right term, and it's got lots of doors which lead to the cells. That's pretty much what it looked like. It was a little bit odd. And then, of course, being a tech conference, you had the very typical accoutrements that you'd expect. There was bean bags, there was a ping pong table, there was beach chairs, there was free soft drink. There was also something that I thought was a little strange, being someone that is female in the tech industry. There was a sponsor for the coffee, which was very generous.
Rebel Coffee, which makes what you're about to say even stranger. Which
was actually a startup based around. My understanding was it was basically so that you could order coffee before you went to the cafe in the morning.
No, it was a bit more than that. It was actually more like pre-buying it.
Was it? Right.
Yeah.
Oh, that's right. You could pay up front
yeah.
and sort of pre-order for the month or whatever, so you didn't have to worry about not having money on you. I think that was it. But I was a little bit confronted because as well as having their free coffee, which is great, they had a couple of young women, very young, thin women with very high-heeled shoes on and very short skirts, lots of makeup, giving out flyers about their business. And I don't know, I mean, there's not a lot of places I've been to in tech where that would fly.
You still, I mean, this is a discussion in itself. You still do see booth babes at some tech events I've been to, especially some of the larger corporate ones, which is a bit irresponsible of them. With those particular two women, it was interesting because I don't know who told them to dress like that.
Yeah.
Because one of them especially, after about an hour, she took the heels off and was very sneakers the rest of the time.
Yeah, I did.
And the other one kept wearing what I would refer to as stripper shoes, like the entire time. But maybe she wanted to. I don't know.
Quite possibly, but
anyway, the coffee was good. It was like rocket fuel, that stuff.
Yeah, it was nice and strong, which is always a treat when you're from Germany because you don't always get.
Oh, come on, that's not true.
The strongest coffee. So
no, I think you're wrong there. But anyway.
Well, the coffee was okay.
So, and they had a few international guests. They had the aforementioned Gilmore Gang. And they also had, is it Dan Nolan?
Dan Lyons.
Dan Lyons, who I'd never heard of, but everyone else I've spoken to seems to have. Maybe you'd like to explain who he is, forever shall be?
Yeah, Dan Lyons has a background in writing. He's worked for a number of publications, including, where has he worked lately? Newsweek, the New Yorker, New York Times, a few different places around. He's also previous editor at ReadWrite, which is where I work now. He was technology editor at Newsweek. And you may know him because he's actually has been one of the screenwriters on the TV series from HBO called Silicon Valley. I'm sure everyone has seen Silicon Valley. Very, very funny television program, sometimes painfully realistic, according to who you speak to. And he's also quite well known of late because he's written one of his number of books, but the most recent one is called Disrupted, and it's actually about his experiences working at HubSpot in the States.
No, in Boston. Yeah.
In Boston, yeah. And if you do get a copy of Disrupted, I recommend people have a read. It's very, very funny.
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, he was talking as an older person working in startups, which is... Yeah, I think that's going to become tech industry, startup industry especially, tends to be very focused around young people and the sorts of people who have the time, the luxury, and shall we even controversially say the luxury and the naivety to work a lot or work the demands that everyone puts on them. And sometimes, when you get past like 30-something, which is not that old really, it's like being a sports person, you're almost considered too old. And but at the same time, lots of founders of some of the early kind of second wave of startups like Etsy and even Airbnb and things like that, they're going to be 40 plus now. So those companies will start to mature, and so will their workforces. So I think it's actually something that's interesting to discuss. And he's not the first person to have... We knew a guy in Australia who also talked about like being a 40-year-old with family in startup world. But he's doing it from a much more humorous perspective, and there were some funny anecdotes there at HubSpot of like the room that no one was really sure what it was for, and things like that.
Yeah, even just your casual kind of ageism, like going into an office and people saying, "So, do you know what Facebook is?" And this is someone who's had a tech journalism history for 20 plus years, Do you know what Facebook is? Do you know what Twitter is? It's a little condescending. And
it's like Friendster, isn't it?
Friendster, God.
Isn't that still going? No.
I don't believe it is. But I do believe, we've seen in the last 5-10 years a lot of emphasis, particularly in the latter part of those years, on diversity within tech. And the two areas that have been concentrated are cultural diversity, but also women in terms of gender diversity. And I'm thinking age diversity or ageism as an actual discriminatory issue will become more of something that is perhaps...
But you bring up an interesting point here, because surely one of the perceived positives of the tech and startup world is that you're a countermeasure, you're an active rebellion against the established, let's talk more generally, but the established middle-aged white male. And okay, the white male maybe isn't being so successful, but the age is. And maybe that industry doesn't want to be old.
Yeah,
maybe that's half the point. I don't know. And we say this as two people who are getting close to that age.
Yeah.
So it's something that has actually been bothering me. I do sometimes go to tech places and I feel old. And I'm only 35, so...
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point, because it's not only that people have had successful careers that are aging, but it's people are entering the workforce in the tech industry a lot later in some instances.
Upskilling after an old industry has collapsed, I guess.
Particularly, as is my experience. I think the notion that people have one career is certainly not the case in tech.
Long dead.
Far from the reality anymore. And I think that's going to lead to an ageing population within tech, because people will be starting something new more than once in their career. And whether that's starting their own startup or it's having a role within either a startup, it's within the policy side of things, it's the media, it's the legal, it's, whatever the consulting arena, the HR arena. So many ways that people are actually...
Horrible words you're using, consulting and HR.
Well,
isn't that why we're in the startup world, to avoid those terms?
Well, I don't know.
Don't you mean the people manager?
Oh yeah, the happiness
and
coach.
external ideas generator, the external disruptor.
The happiness hero.
The external disruptor. That's a consultant.
Disruptor. That sounds like a transformer.
That's a consultant. Even better.
It's a funny one. I was actually reading something today about a startup in the States, and the States is often your example, and it was two people that, I don't know, you want to slap them if you met them. They basically wrote I won't mention the company, but they wrote a fairly long diatribe about employing some people, and there was a contract involved, and that they, as founders, they signed it without having really read it. And it basically gave the employees carte blanche to do very little work. They were effectively kind of trying to take over the company, and everyone was just like, "What? How could you employ people and not read a contract? It's just beyond you." But it shows that these less sexy kind of roles, like your HR and your legal, are imperative if you're growing a company.
Okay, let's. So we'll continue down the Bitspiration path and sort of use it as jump-off points. So the next jump-off point I found interesting, and I noticed this. We also noticed this actually. So we were both at Slush in Helsinki last year, but I also noticed it at other events I've been to in the Nordics before, and it was a little bit in Poland as well. It was interesting because they had three, so the Gilmore Gang and Dan. Keep forgetting people's names, from America, of course, and also a guy called Titus, who is actually Polish, but had been in the Valley for a while.
Titus Sikowski. Yes,
yeah, which is an awesome name. He sounds like some kind of Bond, I don't want to say villain, but Bond
that's a bit racist.
Character. Not really, just the name sounds like, actually sounds like a Roman soldier, I think. But anyway.
Oh, that's more of a compliment, I think.
Not really, but anyway. And I found it interesting because a lot of the Americans, and this isn't the first time I've heard this, and I'm a strong believer in it myself, were bringing up the fact that America and the Valley, especially, are not everything. That Europe is beginning to be able to stand on its own 2 feet, that the Valley is a busy and very pressured place. It's a very expensive place. Apart from the access to funding and the kind of hanging out with a lot of people who agree with you, in some respects, it's not always the best place to be a new startup. And yet there is always this desire to get there as soon as possible, sometimes too soon, maybe. And it was interesting because a lot of the American guests were saying, don't worry about it. Be good at what you're good at. Get bigger, a lot more locally first, etc., etc. And a lot of it made some sense. I mean, these are people who actually kind of know more what they're talking about. They come from that place themselves. And yet a lot of the local speakers were all very much like, you've got to go to the Valley. It's amazing. It's awesome. You've got to go here. You've got to do that. And even some of the speakers were saying things that, in my mind, were complete bullshit. There was a couple of speakers I saw saying that the Silicon Valley was altruistic.
The notion...
I don't get that. I don't know where that comes from.
They were kind of peddling a notion. I know it was well intended, but the notion was that, there's a great Polish community of 30,000 plus people, which there is, but these people will look after you, go there, and people are supporting each other and helping each other. And while it is true in some respects, I think it's more about going there with your eyes open, but also having a plan. And I think Titus made some really good points about that. I went to a session he was presenting, and it was about if you're going to go to Silicon Valley or you're going to go to San Fran, wherever you're focusing, make sure that you're going with a plan in mind. You've got a list of who you're going to speak to. You've got their contact details. You've got some purpose of what you're actually trying to achieve in those conversations, whether it's funding or it's contacts or whatever. But also, he was a bit talking about it in a more of a strategic way of actually saying things like, well, how are you going to make it so that you have meaningful interactions with those people? For example, can you help them with something that they need from you rather than just take? And it was an interesting one because the impression I got of a lot of the audience, they were, for a startup community in some respects, they were a fairly reticent kind of audience.
Very quiet.
almost shy, I would say. I mean, to be fair, there are some people there that were quite young, and I'm not sure if they were students or they were actually running their own businesses. I think there was a lot of people there that weren't in the startup scene, but were very interested in getting involved, seeing it perhaps as a way out of a change of career. And I think one thing that was very much coming across, particularly from the Americans, was the notion that, you need to put yourself out there, you need to have meaningful engagement, you need to be memorable, you need to be helpful, you need to be able to sell yourself, but also have a little bit of humility, and that you need to, have a point of doing these things. And, one thing that I'm just cycling this back, one thing that was also coming across was also the notion that, well, staying in Poland or somewhere in Eastern Europe, wherever, and actually having your own business, successful business where you're funded or, you make a profit, you employ a number of people, small or large, and they're able to feed their families, and that being considered a success as well.
I suppose there's less glamour in that. It's the same thing I've even, people will go and work for a big well-known company, maybe at less pay and less privileges because of the prestige, and I can understand that. We've both worked in charities before, where often you take a pay cut to work on something that you actually think is more worthwhile and
Definitely
leads to more, where you could have been earning more or something like that. It's not always the motivating factor, but yeah, it was interesting, and I think this is something I've seen time and time again. So I've been doing a series of interviews with founders in various countries, kind of around the edges of Europe. I wouldn't actually call Poland on the edge of Europe, but it's sort of getting close to it on its far eastern end, I suppose. And a lot of them are waiting for a success story to give them confidence. And I started these interviews with Estonia. And Estonia's had two very big success stories and a lot of middling success stories as well.
Can you give some examples of those?
Well, Skype is the classic example. It got bought by Microsoft. TransferWise, now Pipedrive, Toggle. I mean, TransferWise, if you look at the funding, I think there was about 3 billion of funding for the Baltics last year. 500,000 of that was all to TransferWise.
Wow.
So they are a big player. And I don't think they're even officially Estonian anymore. I think they're actually London-based now. But they still have a big office there. But that success has given the Estonians a lot of confidence. And I've been to other smaller countries where they don't have that same level of confidence. And a lot of it is just because they're waiting for a big success story. People you interview will give you a list of companies that have been successful, but none of them are up there with something like Skype or TransferWise. They're all companies that have been successful, but unless you live in the country, you've probably not heard of them. And I think Poland's in the same boat. They're sort of waiting for a success story. And the problem with a lot of these countries on the sort of edges of Europe that are in good time zones are a little cheaper in terms of cost of hiring staff, but don't have this haven't had this big confidence boosting success yet. They end up, unfortunately, being a lot of just outsourcing for other countries, which, I mean, generally, most people there are usually reasonably happy to do that, but it does mean that you're kind of in a more just doing the work role as opposed to idea generation and stuff like that. And I guess that's changing. I think to a lot of the smaller countries, the idea of even being an entrepreneur, not being an entrepreneur, because I think entrepreneur, we've got to be careful. Sometimes people think of it like it's a new word. Of course it's not. There have been entrepreneurs in the entire existence of humanity. But okay, startup is actually a potentially viable option now.
Yeah.
And Poland is in the European Union, so they have access to European funding and things, which often is a first point of call for smaller companies. But yeah, I think they're waiting for that big success story. And the one thing I notice with a lot of these events is this real hunger. It's like this constant kind of drive to have to push to London, to San Francisco, to maybe Germany as well, if you want to ignore the kind of English-speaking market and go more wider across Europe. And sometimes it comes across a little strong and a little too much, but I suppose sometimes it's the only way you can do it as well. It reminds me of some of the, going on a slight tangent, but some of the musicians you used to meet in Australia. because the only way to make a career as an artist in a country like that is so isolated is to be really, really fucking good at what you do. They are really good at what they do, and they work really hard, and they have a drive that they have to have. And it doesn't guarantee success, but it's not going to happen without you having it, I suppose.
Although it actually had a postscript, if you like, or a note, in that I've actually spoken to 2 startups who were at the conference in the last week, which I'll be writing up about probably, late on the weekend or early next week. They were Airly, who are a company using IoT and sensors as a way to monitor pollution in the air, and they were creating a product. Well, they've obviously got prototypes already. A product that is kind of sitting a bit between B2B and B2C, I guess, in that they're working with Cisco at the moment to roll it out to companies, particularly government sort of sectors that are looking at pollution monitoring. And the other one I spoke to was a company called Binny, a slightly amusing name. And, excuse me, they were actually doing smart bins, the notion that a bin for your household, as opposed to, a garbage bin out in the backyard garden or what have you. And the notion with these is that firstly it would be able to crush some of your waste, and it would be able to tell you via sensor, of course, and your mobile, when the bin was full and needed to be emptied. I'm not entirely sure how many other particular tricks it could do, because I only had a fairly brief chat with them, but I'll be interviewing them probably Monday, Tuesday.
Maybe it can turn into external disruptor.
Never know. I mean, there are other bin products that are a little bit more...
External destructor.
More exciting, perhaps,
External compactor.
There are bins now in parts of Asia that if you need to empty the garbage bin out in the city, for example, in the tourist areas, the truck is alerted when the bin's full and can come and pick it up and change it. Yeah.
That seems like a lot of toing and froing, a lot of work.
No, it's considered pretty efficient, because otherwise they overflow and the stuff goes everywhere.
Are they human drivers? Or?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, they don't have a robot doing it yet. I think that's probably one for the future. But, I write a lot about IoT, the notion of connected devices, and the idea that they can make things more simpler for a lot of people.
So let's get back. I must admit, I didn't come across any startups or project ideas that really blew me away. There was Brainly, who are fairly well known in certain sectors, who do sort of, I guess, like a private social network and support network for high school students. But the nature of it meant that, of course, I have no experience of it, and it's quite hard for me to know what it does and what it looks like and how successful it is and things like that. But that was quite interesting, especially as I have an interest in sort of technology and education and things like that. We met a lot of very nice people.
Yeah, definitely. Very nice people.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if there was anything else that really... There was one company whose name escapes me right now, but I sort of recognise the name, Van Gogh or something like that. Maybe?
Van Gogh, that's right, yeah.
Yeah, who do the art.
That's
and
right.
you can use an augmented reality app to look at the artwork on the wall. I'd actually like to give that a go. That sounds like a really cool idea. Which that was interesting, because there's always been this notion that technology was going to somehow allow you to see what clothes look like on you, and that's never really worked, because the physical form has meant the clothes, just looking how you look in a picture does not say very much. But projecting a piece of artwork onto a wall or something, that actually is that's pretty viable, because art, of course, is 3D, but it's just a picture or something. It's actually quite a cool idea. I'd be interested to try that out. I found some of the talks were a bit too much, hey, look at me, here's what I do, before they finally got to the actual point of the talk, which I found a little annoying sometimes. I would have liked a few of them more to talk a bit less about themselves and actually get to what they were there to talk about. But aside from that, it was good.
I think
Anyone else you spoke to who really kind of...
Not so much, but I think one comment I'd like to make that I've not seen at conferences, and I'm curious to know from people listening if this is becoming the norm. Perhaps it is that most of the sessions I went to, there was no questions.
So this it depends on the event. So often it's either... Actually, there was time for questions. I think with this particular
in some sessions,
event, they were just running late.
Right, okay.
But actually, the point with a lot of events is to encourage people to talk to each other afterwards. That's kind of the... Firstly, it prevents the people who make a long statement without a question.
That's true.
Which is always really annoying. But also to try and encourage people to network and talk.
Okay.
And it sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. But I think that's some of the intentions there.
It's an interesting idea. I mean, I guess it depends very much on the approachability of the speakers, and in some audiences, the confidence of the audience to talk to speakers.
It does also mean, of course, in a conference like that where people are not speaking in their native language, but the audience member and the speaker are both Polish, for example, they can go and ask questions in Polish as well.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Which is something we often forget about as native speakers. We have a much higher level of confidence about talking in our language at these events when other people don't.
Absolutely.
If you were to ask a question at a German conference, I probably would guess you would not say anything. Think of it that way.
I would. I've spoken at lots of German conferences.
But have you asked a question?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
And you understood?
In English, I understood.
Well, that's what I mean. Yeah, okay. That's what I mean in German.
I'm not sure my German is quite good enough. Yeah.
So think about that. We went to the Speakers and Press dinner. That was very nice.
Very nice.
Polish food, actually, once you kind of get beyond the kind of tourist staples, is actually quite nice.
It was nice.
And then the party was heaps of fun at... I'm still not entirely clear what it was, but some sort of Google... Campus thing.
I think it was part sort of a training kind of space, and it was also a bit of an incubator for startups.
Yeah, it wasn't entirely clear what it was, but it was heaps of fun.
It was fun.
And it made us on the second day a little less enthusiastic.
We were a little bit tired from the. Let's just say at the dinner there were a lot of toasts.
A lot of vodka.
With vodka shots.
Yeah.
Very festive, shall we say.
All in all, it was a good event. Interesting, always interesting to go to places and meet people. I think you left a little early, so I'm going to come back a step. I'd just like to talk very, very briefly about Warsaw and Poland itself. This is a multifaceted podcast, and I've talked about history before.
I'd like to just add something very, very quickly, which is kudos to the organisers.
Yes.
Running an event is bloody hard work, as we know, having run quite a few events, including conferences, and managing volunteers, maintaining volunteers' participation, etc., keeping on time, managing food, all those sorts of things. Hard work at conferences, and they did a really good job. Everyone did a great job.
Yeah. So, I spent an extra day and a half in Warsaw afterwards, as I've now discovered as well. In German, it's Warschau, and there is Warschaustrasse here, which is quite infamous party street.
Oh, yes.
Now I realise what it's named after. It was kind of interesting. We were staying in an Airbnb very close to the city. We left the conference a little early on the second day to do a quick bit of tourist tripping. We went to a cafe that used to be is still part of a monastery. We went and saw the Palace of Culture that was a gift from
Russia?
Stalin or Lenin. I can't quite remember.
I'm not sure.
There's also a smaller one in Riga, but this one is crazy. It's really, really weird. I then discovered a year later, the next day, that there was a big capitalist shopping centre right behind it, which I find kind of amusing. We wandered around a little bit. We went and found some food, etc., etc. Then on the next day, I did a walking tour, which was interesting in lots of ways. Firstly, the old town, and then consequently a lot of the other bits of the town in Warsaw. It's listed as the newest old town in the world. This is largely, it's been a city, I think, since about the 1300s. But this is because during the Second World War, lots of Warsaw got completely levelled. mostly due to the Warsaw Uprising, which was an attempt by resistance groups to have a coordinated resistance to the Nazi occupation. And it wasn't altogether very successful. And the Nazis really retaliated against them, levelling a lot of the city, like about 70%, an insane amount. I think, I can't remember the exact numbers, but something like 100,000 people died in that week alone. And that said, this included, I think, one of the first Jewish ghettos in Warsaw, where after the Second World War, there was only 5% of the Jewish population of Warsaw left, which is insane.
Imagine that.
I think history shows that Poland probably got more than its fair share of brunt of the Nazi
Force.
regime and force, and Warsaw especially. So a lot of it got rebuilt. It was really interesting because, especially some of the old city, it went straight into Soviet control, of course, and because it represented culture and history and religion and things like that were very anti-communist ideals, they didn't really do very much to help rebuild the city, the communist powers. So a lot of it was actually funded and rebuilt by the people, which is really interesting. And because of that, it's meant that certain areas of the old city are actually UNESCO heritage sites, even though they're less than 50 years old. But also interestingly, like on the facade, lots of the places are remodeled in a traditional style. And strangely, lots of the inspiration for rebuilding was from paintings by an Italian painter from the Renaissance. Wow. So they end up having a rather particular character, of course.
Quirky.
But lots of the buildings on the inside are built like the communist ideal. So you get these strange sort of Renaissance era facades to a building, and then like communist style bathrooms.
It's just weird. What's a communist bathroom?
So it's usually quite small, utilitarian. As much as you need, as much space as you need.
Functional.
Yeah, like the sorts of places in Leipzig and in Berlin and things like that. So that was really interesting. And it also turned out that the Airbnb we'd been staying in, which was very much a communist era building, it was sort of utilitarian block, but then on one side were these massive staircase and pillars and archway, which was very, very strange. And then I discovered on the walking tour that was actually the old Jewish ghetto. And so much of it got destroyed. And because there was hardly anybody left to miss it, if you forgive that rather blunt way of putting it, it didn't really get rebuilt. And also the only people who remained, hardly anybody stayed. Lots of them went to Israel.
Yeah, exactly.
And they didn't really even want to remember it, of course.
No.
So it didn't get rebuilt at all and became this kind of communist era estate. But we were staying in there, and that was, once I discovered that, it made the whole area have a different feeling to me. This kind of feeling of like the tens of thousands of people who died there.
Yeah, sinister.
It was not necessarily sinister, but just it played on your mind, that's for sure. So yeah, it was interesting. I read somewhere that at some point in the past, Warsaw was named the second most boring city in Europe to Brussels.
Wow.
And it wasn't necessarily the most lively city in the world, but we had fun, and it was very pleasant and very nice. And I guess the rebuilding work had meant that a lot of places were quite clean.
Yeah, definitely.
Inside the whole kind of tourist ring, it's very set up for tourists.
Yeah.
It doesn't take very long to get out of that kind of ring, and I found that as soon as I walked sort of 10 minutes in the other directions, I was in places where you had to speak Polish. I didn't really know what was going on. And it was quite different. And we were told by locals there that as soon as you get maybe half an hour out, it turns into a very different sort of city. And Poland is still relatively speaking poor, so that's not to be expected.
Yeah,
but it was interesting. We met quite a few people who live there and things like that.
Definitely.
And I think we will have to go back and visit Krakow at some point.
Yeah, I would definitely be keen to spend some more time in Poland. I think it's It's always nice for me because being Australian and historically travel has been something that's been incredibly prohibitive due to sheer cost. And when you're already living in Europe and you can travel to places in Europe where your euros convert really well, it's obviously even cheaper. So it really gives you that incentive to holiday within Europe. And there's a lot of places that we've still not seen, or I've not seen anyway. Chris has seen a lot more than I. And definitely keen to spend some time, particularly over the summer, exploring some of the lakes and things like that.
Yeah. So let's take a quick break from big topics to talk about what else have we been writing about, who else have we been speaking to the past sort of 2 weeks. So let's just take a quick break from the big topics to maybe discuss other people we've been speaking to, other things we've been working on.
Yep.
So I'll kick off first whilst Kate does some hasty research to remember who she's actually spoken to.
Yeah.
Too much vodka.
Really?
I have had a couple of ongoing things. I've been interviewing some people in Albania and Kosovo for another article, which is super interesting. I've been working on some Swift education lessons for a coding school in New York, and that's been really interesting because they want everything very explicit, and I always love that opportunity and need to write everything from bare basics and assume nothing. It really makes you think about concepts and assumptions and things like that, so I find that interesting. I've been gearing up a lot of my time, so I'll have a lot to talk about in the next couple of weeks for WWDC next week, Apple's developer conference, and it's also DroidCon here, so an Android conference. In the run-up to WWDC, Phil Schiller did an interview with The Verge, which I wrote about on SitePoint. They've changed their App Store model a little bit, expanding subscriptions to everybody and anybody, which could be interesting. Instead of paying for apps, it could be that you pay yearly or monthly for apps, which could lead to some interesting changes and interesting ways that people treat apps and developers of apps as, you know, people who actually need to support what users ask for. But also introducing ads in search results on the App Store, which is a little less, skeptically speaking, feels more of just a revenue stream for Apple more than something useful for developers. But anyway, they're both coming on the 13th of June. Apart from that, I'm sure I've been writing other things, but I can't quite remember right now. Have a look on my website, gregariousmammal.com, or look on the blog post that accompanies this for a more comprehensive list of what I've been working on. Kate, what have you been writing about?
Yeah, I've had quite a few interviews over the last couple of weeks. Just related to what Chris was saying about changing into a subscriber model for apps and app extensions, etc., has been something interesting because I've actually been talking to Digital River, who are basically forecasters of commerce, and they work in the space of originally they started doing sort of game subscriptions and things like that, and now they've moved into things like your digital downloads to more intuitive types of transactions. Some examples would be things like your printer is able to identify when you're running low on ink and thus order you link, which will arrive in your mail to your home. Things like really, I guess it's about monetizing services, and this is an interesting space in IoT at the moment. When we think about services that have failed or products that have failed, I guess one example might be Revolve, that where customers, were all up in arms a few months ago because they no longer were able to provide the service. It's really about the fact that it wasn't monetized, and it's really the notion that once you buy a product as a consumer, there are other things to keep you engaged that you pay for, other transactions to have a relationship. And this indeed may change how we see commerce. For example, it may well be that printer, instead of buying a printer, you hire a printer and then you pay per print or per cartridge. Some of those things are probably going to change over the next space, which is, something to really think about when we think about commerce. I guess other things, I've been talking to people in Jaipur, in India, both at Cisco and also at the government offices there regarding some of their work there towards making Jaipur a smart city, where they're looking at things like putting in smart lighting that also has cameras for emergencies, and also is able to do a level of monitoring for things like a mysterious package in the subway or things like that. That's been quite interesting, and India in particular has been quite progressive in the smart cities area. And I think the important thing to stress with this is that the members of public or the citizens, if you like, have been very heavily consulted. There's been a lot of ways to consult them, from competitions to Facebook pages. And they've also looked at it quite holistically, not just, we want to have, traffic lights that do things, but they're also looking at things like affordable housing and transport facilities and public Wi-Fi, just even your basic stuff. Besides that, Intel and Exos are doing some work together, making wearables a bit more meaning, particularly the data. And I also spoke to Arable, which is quite an interesting company in the States, and they're basically doing crop forecasting using sensors to assist farmers and people in agriculture to be able to, predict their growth in crops and as a means of being able to both market effectively, but also predict things like weather and natural disasters. And a lot of that work that they're kind of focusing on is beyond Europe and America to parts of the world where these things aren't mapped. They're not. The data is not being collected in parts of Africa and Asia, particularly because they don't have the technology 24/7. So some of that's been really interesting. Lastly, talking to Cargo Chain, we came across Cargo Chain a few weeks ago at a competition, a blockchain competition here in Berlin, and they came second in the competition. And basically, they're using the blockchain as a conduit for transactions in shipping, because the issue there in international freight is that everything's on paper, there's triplicates of paperwork, if it gets lost there's lots of issues, etc. But really just using the blockchain as a means to reduce, firstly, the paperwork, secondly, be more efficient, thirdly, be more secure in keeping records and transactions. And I think this is going to become more of a way of using the blockchain. And this particular model they were using was quite intent on really solving a lot of the criticisms of the blockchain, namely that it's slow, that it's expensive to use, some of those sorts of things.
The Bitcoin blockchain.
That's right. Yeah, so using IOTA as a distributed ledger as opposed to just using some of the other tools instead.
You just reminded me that something else I've been working on is an article on Eris, which is a roll your own blockchain.
Oh, yeah.
I must admit it's fairly hard to get started with, so it's taken me a while. But
I'm not entirely sure what that means, but I'm sure it's intriguing.
Well, we'll find out soon.
Roll your own blockchain.
Yeah, pretty much. So I've got one other topic I'd like to discuss before we wrap up. It's been talked about so much and I'm almost over it, but I feel like I should get my opinion out there before it's too late.
Sure.
And that is not tech related in the slight, well, sort of indirectly, maybe. And that's the whole issue of Brexit.
Oh, yes.
Now, I am a British citizen. I've not lived there for 10 years, but I'm still allowed to vote. And I don't know. I sort of very mixed feelings about the whole thing. I think a lot of it for me is the feeling of... There's a couple of things. There's the feeling of having a status taken away from... having the potential to having a status taken away from you that you've got used to, which is not something I ever thought I would have to face in my life. And it's kind of very selfish and privileged of me to say that, but that's not something I ever thought would happen. It's the feeling of being a representative of a country that doesn't represent you. That's nothing new. I've got lots of feelings on this whole topic of the kind of digital nomad versus the nation state, which I've covered a little bit in the past, and I wouldn't mind having an entire episode to talk about this.
Absolutely.
But this kind of feeling that in these days it's easier than ever to live somewhere, anywhere, and work anywhere, and yet we're going through a time when nation states are starting to really lock down again, And there's this kind of two very polar opposite movements happening.
Yeah.
So there's a little feeling of that, being representative of a nation, and people will always think of a nation when they first meet you, even if it's nothing to do with you. So there's a little bit of that, and I suppose mostly it's just that I don't even know if we want to stay in Europe, but it would be nice to be able to make the decision when I'm ready to make the decision, not be forced to make a decision maybe, and basically just the fear of the unknown. If they vote out, who knows what will happen. And polls at the moment are in favour of leave, but I don't really trust British polling anymore, to be perfectly honest with you. So we shall see. I mean, yeah, there's a whole bunch of thoughts here, but a lot of it is around that feeling of this increased feeling of nationalism and isolationism, and I'm a citizen of Britain and Australia that are both islands, so of course they're going to have these feelings more in abundance, but it's frustrating. I think it's also that feeling of, I was saying this to Kate this morning, of it always seems to be that there's certain issues that are very strongly, this is generalising, but that are very strongly identified with older people. And by older people, I suppose we mean baby boomers, which is actually, baby boomers are getting on a bit, but let's say 55 plus for sake of argument. And then the opinions that are usually the opposite of those of the younger people. And sometimes it just feels like, when will the opinions of younger people actually be the ones that get played out, as opposed to the older people? Like, I can only think of British examples, but, the Scottish referendum was largely shown to be supported by younger people, and it didn't happen. And if Brexit happens, then it's likelihood that it was the majority opinion of older people again. And, like, when will it be that the 30-somethings are the one who actually have the strong opinions that change a country? It's sort of, I don't know. I think a lot of it for me is the actual kind of end outcome. It worries me slightly because I don't really know what it's going to be. But it's actually more those feelings of just being in a society that it still feels so outdated and old-fashioned sometimes. It doesn't represent me, and I suppose we have to be especially aware that we mix with a lot of people who are very upwardly mobile and have the ability to be able to travel and things like that, and it's hard sometimes to remember that that's not the majority.
That's true.
But we shall see. I don't know. England's always had a love-hate relationship with Europe, and these misconceptions that blocking borders to Europeans will solve migration problems, when actually the vast majority of migrants in the UK are not even from the European Union.
That's right.
And we've been here before so many times with these sorts of discussions, and it's just frustrating that we go round and round having these same conversations about fear of the outsider and et cetera, et cetera. And I suppose it's frustrating for me because it's a country I'm a citizen of having these discussions, but these points of view and opinions are not unique to the UK, not in the slightest, unfortunately. And we've just been to Poland. Poland's also going quite conservative right now. And yeah, I don't know. I just sort of wanted to get my opinions out, and now I'm almost trying to avoid any news coverage of it and just waiting for the 23rd. Probably the next time we get an episode out, something will have happened and we can talk about the outcomes.
Yeah.
But I don't know if you have any particular feelings on it, Kate.
I have a very different perspective. Obviously, I'm not English. I'm Australian. And I guess my feeling, the thing that frustrates me most about it, is there's been very little in the media, particularly the British media, or the UK media, if you like, about the reality of British expats living in Europe and what will be the consequences there, if any. I mean, we're talking about over 2 million people, most in France and Spain. I read an article in The Guardian last week where it was pretty much an enclave of old English aged pensioners living in this place where none of them would speak Spanish. They basically had English food there, they had English newspapers. They supported Brexit because they didn't want all these Polish people in England. Yet they were guests. They couldn't see any irony that as guests in someone else's country, that they should perhaps be a bit more welcoming of others. It was quite ridiculous. And this is going to be the reality. I mean, from all intents and purposes of what people are saying in Germany at least, it's going to take several years for anything to happen, as far as people know.
And what a waste of time and money all that.
You're talking about, can you imagine England having 2 million people come back, many of whom are old and therefore will be putting pressure on the NHS system? It's almost laughable.
I mean, on the flip side of that, if that is the case and that is the outcome, there will also be a lot of people who live in the UK going home.
Well, true.
And I would actually, just to come to that point, and I don't want this to sound like I'm being conservative or right-wing about it, but I would say that the number of EU residents living in the UK probably is bigger than the number of UK people living in the EU. So, yeah, sure. But it's just the mess of it all. Just the confusion and the mess and the total waste of everybody's time over it. But
it's even the same in Australia. I mean, we have quite an anti-immigration government, as will come to no surprises. But
governments hold it up as this system that's worked. Yeah. This is the crazy thing about it.
Statistically, the biggest group of illegal immigrants in Australia is English people who've outstayed travel visas.
I don't actually know if you've picked up on this, but in the UK at the moment, the Australian immigration system is being held up as a shining beacon on 2 counts. A, they've successfully stopped the boats, which is, look that up and you will find all sorts of references to what that exactly means and the kind of crap behind it all. But anyway, that's that. And number 2, the point system that Australia has for rating whether migrants
skilled
could
migrants,
stay.
Etc.
And the interesting thing I've heard about that is some people have said this kind of looking to the Australian point system as a way of replacing the sort of European Union, just come and do what you like sort of policy, is that some predict that would actually lead to more migrants. And if you have this policy, it's the same problem. It's like, so if you let yourself into the European Union and say, well, we don't want to have you, but we do want to have you. It's like, well, you can't have your cake and eat it.
That's right.
And it'd be the same with the point system. It's like, well, just someone gets the sufficient points, you've got to let them in. It doesn't give you any more or less control over who's going to come. I sometimes feel like Britain especially always wants to be in Europe when it's convenient, be out of Europe when it's convenient, and a lot of other things as well. UK and America both have this attitude of sort of, we'll be with you when it's convenient. We'll be with you when it's convenient. We won't be there when it's not convenient, and et cetera, et cetera. And that sort of annoys me sometimes.
Yeah, that's a fair comment.
So yeah, we'll come back to that one. Any other particular topics you'd like to bring up, Kate? Anything that's been on your mind? No? Well, we've been speaking for nearly an hour.
Yeah, I think I'm starting to lose my voice.
This is the first time we've tried this experiment. I'm pretty sure the sound was terrible.
Yeah.
Because we only have one microphone, and I can see the waveform, and it's quite low, and I think it's probably quite echoey. But we'll just keep... And I'm probably not going to do very much editing because of that, because it'll be hard to separate the soundtracks. And Kate, not being used to speaking on microphone, kept moving a lot, which made a lot of noise, so apologise for that.
Sorry.
I guess I should put this at the beginning. There's not much point in apologising for something you've already sat through. But it's like that thing that's always annoyed me when people fart or belch and then say, excuse me. It's like, well, it's a bit too late now. But anyway, that's a whole other discussion. But I think if this works out, we'll probably do this a couple of other times, and then if it works out, maybe we'll invest in another microphone. So bear with us. A lot happening in the next couple of weeks that we'll talk about on the next increasingly inaccurately named Weekly Squeak. I've been Chris Ward, Christian Chiller, and this has been...
I've been Kate, as you can guess.
Kate what? You've only got one name?
Oh.
Kate. I am Kate.
I've been Cate Lawrence. Thank you for having me, Chris, on your program.
Well, maybe it'll become our program.
You never know. And
I will make sure that your social media details and blog details are all in the accompanying blog post. And we will maybe speak to you next time. Or maybe I will. Or maybe Kate will go renegade and do it all on her own.
Who knows?
Someone will speak to you soon. Take care and have a good few weeks until we speak to you next time. Thanks very much.
Talk soon. Bye-bye.